This is the Horse Radio Network.
This is episode 122 of the Dressage Radio Show, brought to you with the generous support of Charles Owen, Equestrian Collections, and Horseshow.com. Hello, I'm Chris Stafford. Welcome back to the Dressage Radio Show as the fall season gets truly underway here. I'm recording, as always, from Lexington, Kentucky, where we've definitely got a little nip in the air, and we're glad of some nice fresh weather after the summer heat. I hope it's ideal where you are and you're enjoying your dressage. We've got another different episode this week. As you know, we always have something new and different here on the Dressage Radio Show. And this week, I'm going to introduce you to a new guest, and that is Paul Belasik. Paul is a very well-known exponent of classical dressage, and he runs the Pennsylvania Riding Academy here in the States. So I was able to catch up with Paul. I want to share that conversation with you in just a second. And later on in the show, we're going to continue our series of tips from the professional equine grooms. Liv Good has another one for us this week. They're going to be on all of my shows, dressage, eventing, and jumping. So if you need any grooming tips, then this is the place to stop by. But first of all, we want to welcome Paul Belasik to the show. As I said, Paul runs the popular Pennsylvania Riding Academy, and we'll hear from Paul how he got into the sport via a more academic route. So let's welcome Paul to the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Chris.
Nice to have you on the show. You know, a lot of people know Paul Belasik. They know you by name. They may have even been to your website. But since it's your first time on the show, Paul, and we obviously talk to a global audience, let's tell them your story. Where did Paul Belasik get the dressage bug?
Well, I actually was born in a city, and no one in my family really had anything to do with animals. I was kind of one of those typical animal-crazy kids, and I had an aunt who was a nurse in the Navy, and she promised me when I was 12 years old, she kept luring me on that she would take me to a friend of hers who had a farm, and it turned out that the man who owned the farm was an expert horseman, and so all my interest in animals kind of shifted a little bit toward the horses, and that was where I first got my start. After that, it became just a continuing passion. I had been involved with all kinds of animal things, including falconry and so forth, but dressage had really did something to me because it was just of all the communication and all the work you could do with animals, it seemed to me to be on another total level by itself. So I went on to college, kept pursuing riding there, and I started in the pre-veterinary program at Cornell University, and then I switched midway because I just didn't think that I really wanted to be a vet. I was more interested in other things and art and so forth, and I was a poet and riding at the same time. And there came a point where I had seemed to have artistic friends and horse friends, and they never seemed to get along. The one thought the other were snobs, and the other thought the other were farmers, and that kind of prompted me to write the first book, Riding Towards the Light. And I just wanted to write a book that wasn't exactly a how-to book, but maybe there were other people who thought like I did and felt these things. And it turned out that there must have been some audience for it because it seemed to be quite popular.
Yes, well, we want to talk about your books, Paul, but I'm going to step back a little bit there. You said where you began. Where exactly were you, and did you have anyone in the family to follow in their footsteps in the horse world?
No one at all. No, there weren't even really many animal people in my family. We were in the city, and this would have been in Western New York and Buffalo, New York, and there really wasn't an example. I was just the one thing I was an avid reader, and back in those days, it's so different now with the internet and so on, but back in those days, you had to really go to a library, and to have horse books, an average person or a kid couldn't afford to buy them, so every Saturday I'd trudge off to the library, and I still remember there was this limit of 7 books per week or whatever, so I would go Saturday, drop off to 7, get another 7, and I guess I don't know if it's a way some people are mentally bent or whatever, but I felt I could learn the things from reading. I know some of my students don't seem to have that ability at all. They really want to visually, they want to see action and so forth. But and maybe it was forced because I couldn't afford teachers and so forth. But I learned to really read the books, and then I could mimic the things or see if these theories worked. And after years and years of practice, I began to realize which authors I felt really knew what they were talking about, and which other theories just really couldn't work.
Yeah, it's interesting. I want to talk about those and who your mentors were. But so you weren't one of these little boys then that had a sister who was horse crazy, and you tagged along there. It was a very academic approach.
Yes, it really was kind of. I took lessons, and then I had after that summer I would take lessons whenever I could, and then I think it was probably I bought my first horse when I was probably around 16 years old or so. So from that point on, I always had a horse and worked with them. But yes, it was pretty much. It was an academic and a practical approach. It was kind of marrying the two: read some theory, and then go back and practice and see if you could bring it into reality. So it was the two things. I really don't think I realized at the time. Later, I would read Belasik's book, and he would always say the best horseman would always match the practical experience with theory. I did it because it wasn't any grand plan. It was all I could do. There was no other way for me.
Well, now, who were those early influences then? The ones that really caught your eye when you were studying those books, and obviously the old great classical dressage masters. There are some that would obviously have influenced your developing style at that point of those formative years, Paul. Who really appealed to you?
Well, I remember that I was always mesmerized with the Spanish riding school and the form, the photographs, and that was intriguing to me. But fairly early on in my career, I met Henry van Schaik, and there was a whole bunch of us who were influenced by him. And he was an amazing teacher in that he was very erudite and really well read, had experience. He had won the silver medal in 1936 at the Olympics. But he was really, really, really young at heart, and he loved to challenge you, and he loved it when you argued with him and so forth. And he was kind of an odd guy in that he was he was this kind of a collector of like new things. He had one of the first computers that I remember. And this is a guy who was much, much older than all of us, those people, but he was so far ahead of us. He was always collecting gadgets and so forth. And he had a camera, and he used to go around the world, and at least once a year he would visit some of these great horsemen, and he would take films of them. These would be the likes of guys like Van Nijndorf or de Paderac or Henriquet, and he would film them. And I don't know how anyone would allow you to do it now with the likes of YouTube and so forth, but he would film them, and he had this great collection. So when you go take a lesson with him or have dinner with him or whatever, he was very, very savvy about just showing you a little bit of a clip, and you would tell him who you thought maybe was this competition rider who was winning prizes, and he would kind of just roll his eyes and say, well, let me show you something else. And then he'd show you this piece of film that would just blow you away with on a whole total different level. And then he'd kind of put it away, and he wouldn't let you see it again for quite a while. So he was a master at setting the hook, but he developed this thirst and this quest in all the students for this different way, this art form, this higher form of riding, this really technical, but also had almost a spiritual element, an art element in it.
Yes, because as you mentioned earlier, that in those days it was easier to go to books, and there was the attraction to go to books because there wasn't the distraction of the internet and video and so on, and younger people maybe don't have that kind of instructional background, if you will, the theoretical background. But it clearly stood you in very good stead to develop your own style. Who would you say that you have developed that style primarily on? Whose influence, if you looked at which European country or European classical masters, Paul, who would you say were most influential?
I would have to say would probably be sort of the Austro-Hungarian style that you would see the Spanish riding school riders, but even maybe German riders more like a Vachin or a Soinig. Position was very important to them. They were real stylists. They were they may or may not have competed. Very often competition wasn't there. Podhajsky was known for his competing, but there were many of the teachers he learned from the Spanish writer school really didn't have much of an interest in competition. They were really sort of equestrian artists. So I would say it was more that style. For me, it blended the kind of almost the artisticness of the sort of French style, but the precision of the German style on top of it. So it spoke to me, and over the years I come back to it over and over again. When I explored every kind of school of riding there is, I think, and I still come back there. That for really understanding the elements of collection, for proper position, in order to be able to achieve those things in dressage, they still stand out to me. That school of riding.
Well, this, as I said, is an interesting beginning and unusual in the modern day, as people usually are so competition-driven and not developing that classical foundation to dressage so much as just being competition-driven. Which is the most persuasive to you now? Do you yearn to get into the competition arena, or are you very focused on teaching those principles?
No, I was never really big on competing, although I competed at almost all the levels. And I have horses now. My assistant, Andrea Vellis, who's been with me a long time, she competes our horses, and we almost always have a horse in the FEI, Grand Prix horse out there. But for me, it's never been, even when I worked with a lot of competitive riders, I always felt that if you really took care of the details and you rode very well, then the winning would take care of itself. There's a certain point where you're going to have to entertain politics, and there's not much you're going to be able to do about that, and you may not want to do about that. But if you ride well, it's going to stand out, and in the long run, you'll get your share of praise or rewards. But you'll also become a really good rider. But I think it's a real problem today when you see, we were just talking about the internet a minute ago, is that I find too many of the young people really don't know where the source material is. So they take it on fact that what they see on the internet might be correct. Much of this stuff is really under-researched, and oftentimes it's misquoted, and a lot of times it's completely wrong. And they could easily, it's not impossible to go to the source material to find Gary Neer's book or Podhajsky's book or Steinbrecht's book, and to read these books and to know what these men are saying, and then make a better judgment. But it's really lacking. I don't know of any other school of endeavor that you could study art. If you would have to study art history. But in writing, we get away with murder with the young people with knowing nothing sort of below 1950.
Yes, that's very interesting, of course, and certainly for the present generation, not even pre-internet. There's not the study base there. And you mentioned those, of course, great masters. It's interesting, just as an aside, Paul, and you will appreciate that all of these were men, of those early masters before women became active, probably in the competition arena. But it was dominated by men in its classical form in the early days, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that's one of those cultural things. I think the interesting thing about riding and equitation is that it's probably the only, if you want to look at it as a sport and you look at it's probably the only sport where men and women compete on an equal basis now. So from its roots of being really a chauvinist thing, it's really turned around the other way to being really an example of how equal and democratic the whole art form is. And there's no other activity that you can get in and where the strength won't dominate eventually. So you'll have athletes. What do? They all take drugs today. Why? Because just a few ounces more strength will determine who can win. But that's not it in riding. It's not about strength.
We will continue our conversation in just a moment, but first of all, I want to remind you about one of our sponsors here on the Dressage Radio Show, and that is Charles Owen, who are well known for making helmets, but they also produce gloves as well. And one of those is the Röckel Chester glove, which is a lightweight, close-fitting glove made from Vesta synthetic leather. They also do the Röckel New Aston glove, another stylish synthetic leather glove that comes with rain reinforcements and an elasticated wristband. The back of the glove is breathable, which prevents the buildup of sweat. These gloves are both practical and hard-wearing, making them ideal for everyday use. And you can find out more about these gloves and all of the helmets that Charles Owen produces, as well as the rest of their products, on their website by visiting charlesowen.co.uk. Well, Paula, the other area I want to talk about, as well as your books, is also the academy that you have in Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. Tell us how that is structured. Then, if it's not competition focused, as you pointed out earlier, that will follow if you have all the principles, mm-hmm. the foundation of your riding correctly. Do you attract mostly young people that are in pursuit of the art, or are they ultimately competition driven? What do you offer at the academy?
Well, it would be a big mix. I teach all kinds of people, and it would be hard to put them in the category. But what usually I would probably be more analogous to saying that, like, our short courses are a short week of intensive, and it would be more like if you were a golfer and you might have a swing coach or something, or a dancer. Even though these can be accomplished people, they feel they have to come back somewhere and have their position checked because they get involved in too many other things. So we do that. We also teach day students who come in here who are local and travel in, but we are our main sort of focus, besides our breeding program and our own training of horses. For the training of people, it's primarily the short courses where you come and you get an intensive. You can bring your own horse, or you can use one of our school horses, and there you can kind of come here and chill out, stay on the farm, observe training all day long of all horses from the lowest level to Grand Prix, and with complete transparency. There, like in many schools, there isn't 2 hours of the arena that are blocked off where no one's allowed to go in there and see what happens. For here, you can see anything you want at any time. It's wide open, what we do. And it's not always perfect or beautiful, but it's real. And I would hope that it would never be cruel or brutal. You would see it as being really productive. So students of all kinds, as long as they have to be reasonably fit, meet the body mass index, and they can schedule a short course and come and work essentially on position.
Especially on position. So let's talk about that then, Paul, because obviously you want to establish those basics. Do you put them on the lunge line? Would they expect to spend a long time on the lunge line with you?
No, not necessarily. What over the years I've found is that most of the people that come, they're going to have a basic. They're not going to be absolute beginners. They're going to have a basic knowledge, but they're probably going to have some faults. But I've found that really a lot of the problems come in riding in position is when you take up the reins, and then that trying to balance whether if the horse is pulling on the reins, if the horse is too light on the reins. But it's that connection of the reins to your core that is really the significant part. So when you ride on the lunge line, which is very good, of course, for setting up your seat and so forth, but it doesn't challenge your balance enough. And then when you pick up the reins, you think, oh my God, now what? This is a totally different thing. So I often like to let them have really safe and perfect horses that they can take hold of the reins. The horses really won't pull on them, so they can still concentrate on position, but they're going to have to pay a little bit of attention to that whole realm of a quadruped's balance. So, and I like to do that more now, and I find that a rider makes faster progress when they can sort of have all of these, hold all the parts of the horse, and then work that way.
So you would obviously be an advocate of rider biomechanics, which we talk about often here on the show, Paul, because that you mentioned the core and the relationship of the rider's core to the horse and the connection. Do you study biomechanics, or do you instruct biomechanics in that sense, or is it integrated in the riding and not as a separate subject?
No, it's I study constantly biomechanics, and I have really some great friends who are experts in the field who are always telling me the latest things that are coming up and so on. So, no, we work on that. We work on it nonstop all the time. In fact, the first lesson when you come here, no matter what level of riding, we work on the exercise ball and on a stationary horse, and we just go over some fundamental things. They're little odd sort of little tricks and things that I can show a rider the feeling of it in a short amount of time, and then of course mimicking that on a horse and practicing to get it consistently. Well, that's going to take you years, but you can usually set up a rider so they can get a tiny glimpse of what they should be trying to feel by using these biomechanical exercises. So absolutely, I use it all the time.
And apart from your short courses, you also do clinics, don't you? You travel around the country to give clinics?
Yes, I just came back from Edinburgh, Scotland, just the day before yesterday. So, I travel all over to do clinics. Yes, I'm trying to never, because we have a lot of horses in training. We're a regular training establishment. We train horses for other people and for ourselves to prepare a few each for sale. So I limit them to only two per month.
Right. And how do you structure your clinics, Paul? What would your attending clinicians expect if they wanted to attend?
They're always 45-minute sessions, and with a limit of 10, usually on Saturday and Sunday. I try to arrive at the place on a Friday or whatever, and then I can return if it's not too far away. I can return Sunday night, or else I come back on a Monday if I'm on the West Coast or somewhere. But in general, it'll be Saturday and Sunday. Sometimes if I can arrive early on Friday, there'll be a couple of lessons on Friday. But 2 days of teaching, 45-minute sessions, 10 sessions on Saturday and Sunday.
How would you describe your style if someone wanted to, if you wanted to sell yourself, so to speak, in a few sentences? How would you describe what you offer, Paul, and your style of riding based on the classics?
Well, one of the things that I do, I think my lessons might seem a little different than other people, is I always start off by asking the rider to just tell me a little bit about themselves and their horse, so that I don't come in with, the clinic or the theme is going to be shoulder in and everybody's going to get a lesson on shoulder in this clinic or whatever I happen to be interested in. I try to take every rider as an individual, and I really made it my sort of duty to make sure that every lesson gets the same amount of attention. If I'm sort of the flu or whatever, I'm still going to work hard, and I don't have a glass of wine at lunch so that the afternoon lessons are different than the beginning. So I don't think anyone who's ever been to any of my clinics could ever say that they didn't see me put in the same amount of energy in the first lesson as the last lesson. So you're going to get my fullest attention, and you're going to get, I'm really interested in rider position, because I think that the position is the key to be able to be functional and on the horse. And then I look for sort of significant, anyone can find things that are wrong in a horse or a rider. But what I'm trying to do is evaluate is one or two or maybe three at most of those significant things that would, if they were corrected, would make a quantum leap for the rider. So it's not just I don't look for a lot of just little mundane, busy corrections, but I'm trying to observe really carefully to see what would be a really significant one or two changes that would really jump the whole team up. So that's kind of the way I go about it.
But before we go any further, I want to remind you about one of our sponsors here on the Horse Radio Network's Dressage Radio Show, and that, of course, is Equestrian Collections, who are our loyal supporters on the Horse Radio Network. And if you're shopping for a young rider, then Equestrian Collections gives you the very best choice of riding apparel, footwear, gifts, helmets, and safety gear for your young riders of any equestrian website in the world. And there's always great everyday promotion prices too, with an enormous selection from head to toe. Equestrian Collections have young riders covered. You can shop the Young Riders department at equestriancollections.com or in the horse department. And you can use coupon code HRN at your checkout and get $10 off your next order of $100 or more. Equestrian Collections is a participating retailer of the Horse World Gives Back campaign. Of course, you have published several books, Paul. Let's talk about your books and how did that all come about? Because we do share the same publisher, in the interest of full disclosure. J.A. Allen have published a number of your books. Mm-hmm. How did that all come about? What was the catalyst to becoming an author as well as a classical horseman?
Well, as I told you a little bit earlier, is that I was a trained writer, and I was part of the Cornell writing program, and I had a very famous poet was a teacher of mine, and I actually had published some poetry, and so I was a writer. But I didn't think of ever that was kind of this artistic writing, and I never thought about really. And I wrote articles for horse magazines, but I didn't think about a book. I had all of the books that I had loved, almost all of them. When I think of all the authors, they were all, as you know, Allen. That was the stable to be in. All of the great writers, Allen published all their books. So I thought if I ever do publish a book, well, that's the publisher I wanted to be aligned with. And at that point, Mr. Allen was still alive and Caroline Burt was there. It was a pretty impressive place, even though it was kind of, as you know, if you've been there, the roof leaked a little bit and there was stuff, but it was in a great location. And
it was a wonderful location. If anyone listening has ever remembers going to Alan's bookstore with the publishing offices overhead, just across the street from the Buckingham Palace, from the Mews, Royal Mews, and as you said, the roof leaked. But it was very Dickensian, but it was utterly charming and very efficient. And Caroline Burt, who I should add is a great dear friend. I worked with her there for quite some time, and it really is. If you're going to get into publishing, it was the most charming way to do it, wasn't it? Yeah, and Carolyn was. She's always been great, and I really missed her when she retired a lot, because when I did write The Riding Toward the Light, it wasn't a very usual writing book. It was a little unusual, and I didn't know that anyone would really want to publish it. But she was pretty keen on it from the beginning, and she was really an ally of mine, and she always has been. And I really owe a lot to her. But that's kind of how it started. So after Riding Toward the Light, my intention when I wrote it was always that it was not to be just a single book, but I wanted it to be kind of follow the traditional apprenticeship, journeyman, craftsman phase, the way craftspeople learn their skills, and so that's how the first three books came about. They were a book more or less about my apprenticeship, and then a second book more about technical aspects and a journeyman, where you're trying out all these techniques, you're trying to get really familiar and comfortable with expanding your craft, and finally the last one, which is more about being a little bit comfortable with the technique so that you actually might be able to produce art, or you don't have to pick up your violin and count where the notes are. You go and you want to produce feelings more, and that was kind of the first three. And tell us the titles of those, Paul. Pardon me? Tell us the titles of those books. Oh, yeah. Yes. So the first one was Riding Towards the Light, and I think that was published in 1990. And then the second one was Exploring Dressage Technique, 94. And then Songs of Horses came in 1999. It was 7 stories for the riding teachers and students. And then it was not long after that, I think, that then in partnership with Trafalgar Square here in the States, the publishing company, that they put them all together in a trilogy and entitled it The Essential Paul Belasik. And I wrote a new foreword for it, and then so they put those all together. And now, of course, you have two other titles. Let's talk about those two titles. And we should, while mentioning Alan's and Caroline Burt, you now, again, we shared this, someone who has been an editor for me too. That is, of course, Leslie Gowers, who's still with J.A. Allen and part of Hale Books in London. And you have two other titles there to tell us about. Yeah. Search for Collection and Dressage for the 21st Century. What could we expect in those, Paul? Well, the 21st Century, Dressage for the 21st Century, is a bigger book, and some people will think of it almost like a small coffee table book, but that was never my intention. Caroline Burt approached me about it, and then it was co-published with Trafalgar Square here in the United States. And for me, it was meant to be a manual. I wanted it to be a really comprehensive kind of manual that, like you would see in people working in a garage, and they'd pull out to fix their old Austin Healy, and they'd pull it out and it would grease all over, but they would study it, and that's what I wanted it to be. My good friend Carl Leck, who was an outstanding international photographer, lived around me at the time, and he agreed to go in with me on the project. And this was before digital cameras, so there was no photoshopping here. All the photos you're seeing there were they really happened. They worked, and so I have often found myself trying to explain these brilliant photos of Carl, but trying to get some language to go with it. And I had a great illustrator living in a cottage on my farm, and Brian Tutlow did some great drawings in it. So I thought it was a really good project, and it was kind of pretty well received. Search for Collection is the current book, and that's a little bit more toward Riding Towards the Light. It also talks a little bit about my work we talked about some biomechanics, but with Dr. Hillary Clayton in Michigan here, and we worked on a project with some different experiments, and one of them was measuring the Levad for the first time in history on the force plates. And so I talk a little bit about what was that experience like and what did that mean for the theory of collection and so forth, because some of these things had never been proven scientifically. So that's what that book is about, and also some psychological aspects. Very interesting. Yes, of course, we've had Mary Wanless and Heather Blitz and also Dr. Hilary Clayton on the show in the past. So you're all sharing a common theme there to improve the rider's position through rider biomechanics and studying the art form. A search for collection seems a pretty challenging title there, Paul. What was the conclusion?
I think that it's just that. It's a search, and this collection, it's a term that we use in writing, but it's also a term for a human being, how you would go through life. That hopefully, with a little practice, that your psychological state you become a better human being. Maybe you learn more patience. And so it's also learning the same thing to be able to gather to your own core as the horse does its own, but not only your physical core, but to a certain psychological core, so that you can enter the state that many athletes feel that they enter almost by accident. That's that kind of state of flow where you don't think about money, you don't think about results, you just think about the action. It's a pure action, almost a Zen feeling. So I think that's a little bit what that book is about, too.
And Dressage for the 21st Century?
And that, as I say, that is the manual. That's the manual. Yeah. Yes. And that was the one where it was sold out, and then the rights reverted back to me, so we used the same Chinese publishers, and we've now reprinted a limited edition, which is signed and numbered, and if anybody wants copies, they are still available, and you can get them by just emailing me, and you can always find my email on my website.
Absolutely. We will, of course, put a link to your website, Paul, on our show notes, so you can follow with Paul. You can find out more about what he does there at the Pennsylvania Riding Academy at Lost Hollow Farm. What a lovely name, Paul. How long have you been at Lost Hollow Farm?
7 years now, yeah. So.
Yeah, lovely location. All right, and we, of course, will be sharing also on our Facebook page. You can go to Paul Belasik. Do you have a Facebook page as well? Do you have a following there, Paul? Do you use new media?
No, we don't. I don't have Facebook. We just pretty much use our website and email.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll make sure we link to that, and you can find out more about Paul's books. I want to thank you so much for spending time with us, Paul, and good luck with all of these titles.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I'm glad you had me on the show.
Well, before we go any further, I want to remind you about one of our other valued sponsors here on the Dressage Radio Show, and that is horseshow.com, because you can go to horseshow.com now and compete online, just like you were at a regular horse show. You can get judged by the top judges, and you can get the judges' comments. Just upload your home video and enter a class online to win at horseshow.com. It's a simple and economic way for you to compete with your horse from home. It's also a great way to prepare for your next show or track your progress during the off-season. Horseshow.com features real horse shows for multiple breeds and disciplines, and they're judged by nationally accredited judges. So why wait when you can go anytime to horseshow.com to upload your video, enter with a chance to win. That's horseshow.com. Well, it's time now for our tip of the week from the professional equine grooms. Liv Good is going to join us and going to bring us a tip each week, either on the Dressage Radio Show, the Eventing, or the Jumping Radio Show. So let's hear what Liv has for us this week. Well, Liv, welcome to the Dressage Radio Show. Nice to have you on the show again. I believe you've got another tip that's going to be useful, not just to the grooms, although, of course, we're talking about these tips coming from the grooms, and nobody knows better how to find these little tips and tricks, do they, than the grooms out there?
That's what we're hoping. We hope there's a bunch of really knowledgeable grooms out there. And the tip I have for you today involves the sheepskin pads that is very common to see on a dressage horse. And the care for those sheepskin pads, because they are so very delicate and yet so critical to the performance of the horse in terms of how comfortable the horse is. They are tricky to wash. You can get specific washing agents to use in the washing machine for them, but you'll find that when they come out of the wash, they're not exactly fluffy and comfortable. So what I like to do is get a dog grooming brush. They are made of wire, very, very thin, stiff wires, and you can fluff up your sheepskin pads with the dog brush. And if you have barn dogs running around, they like it as well. So it's a 2-for-1. What happens then is the sheepskin gets all fluffy and subsequently the saddle fit is much better and much fluffier and much more comfortable for your horse, which is, of course, ultimately, the end goal here. The other reason for doing this is also so that you can take your sheepskin pad, flip it upside down, and see if there's any uneven wear, meaning one side of the sheepskin is maybe a little more compacted than the other side, which might be a reason for you to call your saddle fitter out. So it's not only taking care of your products, but it's taking care of your horse and preventing future saddle fit problems. It's a 3-for-1 special.
That's terrific. I love it. All right, Liv. Well, thank you so much for that. We look forward to more tips from the professional equine grooms. We'll see you back on one of these shows very shortly. Thank you so much, Liv.
You're welcome. Have a great day.
Well, that's it for this week's show. Don't forget to check out all our notes at dressageradio.com or leave your comments, questions or suggestions on Facebook as well. If you prefer to email me, my direct email here at the network is Chris, CHRIS, @horseradionetwork.com. And don't forget, if you're under 20 years of age and would like to give us a report about your show here on the Dressage Radio Show, then send me an email too. Love to hear from you. Any young reporters out there, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, we would love to hear about your show. And also, of course, you can follow us on Twitter here at the Horse Radio, and Chris E. Stafford is my Twitter name, Chris Middle E. Stafford. That's it for this week. I'll be back with lots more content next week and future episodes here. We've got the Pan American Games coming up this fall, so stay tuned for news of that as well and coverage of that. We'll also be bringing you coverage of the Olympics too next year, so you might want to start thinking about that, how you're going to follow the Olympic Games from London, England, because right here on the Horse Radio Network, we'll be bringing you coverage, daily coverage from London on the eventing, dressage and jumping radio shows. So all that to look forward to and a lot more. Of course, Wellington this winter as well with the dressage and the Masters competitions. So much going on in the sport, but we do want to hear from you as well. I love to hear from you wherever you are in the world about your competitions and what's happening in your backyard and any training questions you may have. And if there's anyone you'd like me to have here on the show, just send me an email. But that wraps it up for now. I will, of course, be back the same time, same place next week. So until then, thank you all for listening.